Welcome everyone to the Yissilmissil Productions channel. My name is Steven Yissel, and today we are continuing our deep dive series into the Bermuda Triangle. So, we are picking up from where we left off with Chapter 2. We left off at the bottom of page 45, and I hope you all have been doing well. Just get a few things going here before we start. Alright. So the rest of this chapter is about 30 pages. I try to keep this between two. Or like 2 parts, 20 pages apiece. But we're going to try to knock this out here, alright guys? Make sure you hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this around. Just to show you where we're picking up from here. A saga of disappearing planes and lost ships. Alright, let's get going. Ship disappearances were considerably more sensational because of their size, floating deckworks, and sometimes buoyant cargoes. The coastal freighter Sandra, with a cargo of DDT, vanished in June 1950 on her southward course after passing St. Augustine, Florida. Further north, ostensibly a more unusual disappearance occurred on December 6th, 1954. The Southern Districts, a wartime LST converted to cargo ship carrying sulfur of about 314 feet overall length and 3,337 tons, disappeared somewhere between its last sighting off Jupiter Inlet, Florida, on December 5th and 5:58 p.m. December 6th, when the ship did not answer radio messages sent to it via Savannah, Georgia. The Gulf Keys was the last vessel to have sighted the Southern Districts as it passed her at Jupiter Inlet on its way north. Because the Gulf Keys reported heavy seas that evening, it was assumed that the Southern Districts went down in foul weather with all 23 hands. 3 years before, her sister ship, the Southern Isles, had inexplicably plunged below the waves off the Carolinas and would effectively have been posted missing if another nearby ship had not seen her running lights suddenly drop into the sea, as if the vessel simply dropped into a pool of ink. As if the vessel simply dropped into a pool of ink. Since Southern Districts and Southern Isles were LST conversions, suspicion was cast upon structural failure resulting from the conversion process. Yet the mystery of the Southern Districts is not so simply solved. On January 2nd, 1955, the captain of the SS Tullahoma spotted a ring buoy with the Southern District's name stenciled, quote, very legible on it in block letters, end quote, plus a 2x8-foot gangplank and a gray life jacket. However, the debris was found floating off Sand Key in the Florida Straits, a location hundreds of miles south of Jupiter Inlet where the vessel was last sighted. Because the current in the Florida Straits is northbound, the debris could not have floated against the current from where the vessel presumably vanished off Florida or Georgia. Excuses to explain the debris often cite that the ring buoy alone was found and that it simply must have been tossed over because it was defective. An explanation also offered by the Marine Board without considering the other items found floating nearby. No shred of evidence remained to explain why the disappearance of the 450-foot Sam Key, that's the name of another ship, on or about February 1st, 1948. The vessel was a wartime Liberty ship, a type of vessel designed originally to haul cargoes and not the result of conversion to accommodate post-war business. She was also a relatively new ship, only a few years old. She had passed the Azores signaling, quote, all well, end quote. Sometime thereafter, before her next 48-hour check-in time, she vanished. Coincidentally, this would be in an area approaching the Triangle. Although no clue was found, the British Marine Board of Inquiry dogmatically affixed a cause, declaring that her Thames ballast had shifted, resulting in the ship suddenly capsizing with all 43 hands aboard. One wonders if the phenomenon of the Bermuda Triangle had already been established, whether the board would have risked its reputation by dogmatically asserting any cause for disappearance in fair weather. Aircraft disappearances remain the most alarming since their routes are carefully monitored and their time en route is considerably less than seagoing freighters, amounting to only hours in flight over the Atlantic as opposed to a freighter's several days in passage. Comparatively speaking, aircraft obviously spend an even shorter time passing through the Bermuda Triangle since it occupies only a fraction of the expanse of the North Atlantic. Nevertheless, major aircraft disappearances are primarily concentrated over the Triangle. A particularly baffling disappearance occurred on October 30th, 1954, to Flight 441, a four-engine Navy Super Constellation ferrying 42 passengers to the Azores, family of military personnel stationed overseas. Everything went fine in the flight after the aircraft had taken off from Patuxent River Naval Air Station in Maryland, until coincidentally when north of Bermuda, where afterwards it sent no more updates. It is relevant, in fact unavoidable, to note that the lack of the search finding any trace here is particularly strange, considering that the cargo consisted of paper cups, life jackets, and even large life rafts. The lengthy and intense, though negative, search was called off, with cablegrams then sent to the surviving members of the families. The cablegram to the Flanger family is typical. And here's word for word that cablegram. And it's typed in all capital letters. With deep regret, I must tell you that search operations for this missing aircraft have been discontinued without revealing a trace of the plane or any indication of survivors. X. Your husband, James Richard Flager, is now officially considered to have lost his life in the service of his country in the great tragedy X. You will receive further details by letter X. I wish to assure you of every possible assistance, together with my sincere sympathy in your great loss, X. So that's the end of the cablegram there. More officiously, the Navy commiserated with the families in a subsequent telegram. It is when elaborating on the search efforts that we get a vivid sense of the unbelievable nature of mystery in this disappearance. Quote, the intensive phase of the next 12-day search for the missing Navy Constellation has not uncovered a trace of the aircraft or its passengers. During the search, some 260 aircraft of the Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard participated. In addition, 27 surface vessels, including 2 aircraft carriers, participated directly in the coordinated search. A total of over 16,000 personnel participated in the search. Records indicate that this search is the greatest on record in scope and most intensive yet conducted. We must reluctantly conclude that it has established that there are no survivors. End quote. North of Bermuda, in the same general area, about 300 miles, on November 9th, 1956, a Martin Marlin, a large U.S. Navy amphibian patrol plane with a crew of 10, also vanished. In this case, the freighter Captain Lyras, and that's spelled Lyras, signaled that an airplane passed nearby and simply flew into the ocean. Not crash, it was stressed. Just flew into the ocean, 6 miles distant, at a steady, even rate and angle of descent. The Marlin was capable of landing on the sea, but the angle was just enough that the aircraft hit the surface and exploded, without the pilots taking any evasive action. A board of inquiry could only speculate that there was instrument malfunction. The report noted that an altimeter error of 300 feet existed in that area, which, if the pilots did not compensate for, they may have thought they were much higher when they flew into the ocean. This last surmise is surprising, considering they had just seen the lights of the Captain Lyras and could estimate thereby their altitude over the sea. At least enough to know they were fairly close. In light of developments in other cases, we would have to suspect that this could be yet another example of pilots who could not see out of their windows, and moments in which instrument gauges simply did not work. Again, in this general area north of Bermuda, an 8-engine B-52 designated, quote, Pogo 22, end quote, vanished on October 15th, 1961. Pogo 22 was last seen by its cell partner, Pogo 13, as they, along with the other B-52s on this exercise, the exercise titled Sky Shield 2, separated to 10-mile lateral intervals and headed direct back to North Carolina and Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. Pogo 22 simply never arrived, having sent no SOS, and a massive, though fruitless search ended on a discordant note, like in the other cases of missing aircraft. Nothing reasonable can explain the simultaneous mid-air destruction of two KC-135 Stratotankers south of Bermuda on August 28, 1963. The KC-135 were Boeing 707s, specially factory designed to be used for refueling in midair, a task that had jointly accomplished, and now they were heading back, or a task they had jointly accomplished. I was adding a word in there. And now they were heading back in tandem to Bermuda. Without any indication of trouble, Kindley Field lost contact with them. A search soon discovered a debris field, which, given the large size of both jetliners, was surprisingly small. The conclusion of the Air Force Investigating Board was that the aircraft must have collided in midair, but nothing was advanced to logically explain how experienced pilots, supposedly not flying that close, could lose control and collide. It was as if the two jets simply hit an invisible brick wall at the same time, and thus neither crew had time for a mayday. A particularly sensational disappearance occurred on the morning of March 18th, 1960. To the lagging jet fighter and a squadron of 5 other F-104 starfighters. Designated Poly Alpha, this set was the first group of 18 jets that would take off from Kindley Field, Bermuda, and head to Spain. The jet in question, Poly Alpha 4, under the command of Morris Larson, was tardy in climbing and joining his squadron. At a steep incline, he entered the haze layer and vanished. No part of the jet was captured on radar as descending or falling to the sea. When it was realized the fighter was missing, the scramble alarm was hit and several fighters and search craft were launched. Randy 12, one of the rescue choppers, scoured the sea north of Bermuda. Visibility was down to 500 feet from fog, but still enough to determine that the sea surface showed no sign of an impact. Search units raced up above the haze and cloud tops, thinking that Poly Alpha 4 was above and trying to link up with the squadron, because they didn't see a wreck below. Failing here, the search concentrated at sea level for days, and though still over the shallow Bermuda banks, no trace of the large jet fighter was ever found. So I'd just like to point this out here. The entire Bermuda region, like around that island, is very shallow. You could see the bottom of the ocean there, because it's almost, I think like the deepest parts are like 30 feet, so you could see everything in that area. And this is the area where these planes disappeared, and they find no debris or anything. Alright, continuing on. Minutes after leaving Dover, Delaware, on the night of May 27th, 1962, a 4-engine MATS C-133 Cargo Master simply flew into the void. Radar and radio contact had been normal as the flight was directed to its cruising altitude. After the pilot confirmed reaching 17,000 feet, the plane vanished from the scope. It was assumed that the aircraft must have crashed, but a huge search uncovered only a tire and a tattered life raft. Such minimal debris created quite a chord of mystery, considering that as the largest cargo plane of its time, it carried 50,000 tons of assorted cargo. No fuel slick was reported. Again, a startling fact, since most of its 85,000 gallons had not been spent yet. Examination of the tattered life raft revealed a cross-section of the C-133 reduced to mere particles, including paint, glass, aluminum, and an unidentified, quote, minute magnetic particle, end quote. So we have unidentified metal here. A year later, on September 22nd, 1963, another C-133 disappeared in the same area. But unlike its predecessor the year before, it occurred in what might be called steps, beginning with what seemed the masking of its electronic and radio signals until final physical disappearance from the radar scope. So I have a suspicion here. I'm going to weigh in with my thoughts here for a moment before we get back to reading. It's not all the disappearances, but some of them are being intercepted by something else. Whether it's our own people, or if it's something interdimensional. We're dealing with a lot of different things here. So just keep that in mind. Let's continue. It had not long left the U.S. East Coast, also from Dover in Delaware, when it began to fade from the radar scope and its communications became weak. The pilot rogered the request to, quote, indent, end quote. That is, to send an electronic signal to assist in identification on the scope. Nevertheless, this, quote, SIF, or selective identification feature, did not appear. The operator immediately contacted the cargo master and told the pilots that their aircraft was only registering skin returns. That is, the actual radar wave echo off the fuselage of the aircraft. So it's just bouncing back radio signals. It's not giving its own signals out. It's just bouncing back whatever it's trying to communicate with it. Radio replies were heard but proved to be weaker, the last being a faint, quote, Roger, roger, end quote, in response to reporting cruising altitude. So I guess they did hear it. But they were getting their own signal bounced back to them, it sounds like, too. Within all of that. Dover then lost the radar return. A radar plot from skin returns alone, not confirmed, but most likely the C-133, continued to be tracked by New York for a few miles and then vanished between the next sweep of the radar scope's arm. So just like these scopes down on the bottom below me, by the time one revolution happens, they were gone. They weren't on the radar anymore. Though something unintelligible over the radio was heard later by Dover. In this case, a search found nothing in the location of the last, quote, raw, end quote, radar return. It then naturally quickly expanded along the aircraft's flight track to the Lahays in the Azores, but this still proved fruitless. In the end, the Air Force investigators had to assume that the C-133 had vanished only 25 miles off the coast and left no trace. Failure at finding a trace in this area inspired a sonar grid search, which also found no trace on the bottom, including any clue of the C-133, which presumably had crashed here the year before. Given they vanished each within 25 miles of the coast, and that the searches were prompt, the lack of debris and lack of a fuel or oil slick is particularly intriguing. On a much longer run, but essentially the same course as the cargo masters were intending to fly, to Lahays on the Azores, a KB-50 aerial tanker, quote, Tyler 41, end quote, vanished on January 8th, 1962. From radio messages, it was last known to have been north of Bermuda, on its eastbound course from Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. The lack of any trace of this aircraft was so frustrating that 5 Coast Guard vessels searched its entire course from its last reported position north of Bermuda to the Azores, but found nothing. A huge area of sea estimated at 440,820 square miles. And that's it. 440,820 square miles. The Air Force ventured no guess. The report concluded, quote, no trace of any survivors or wreckage was ever found, thus preventing the accident board from obtaining any physical evidence upon which to base their investigation, end quote. A considerably less area of sea had to be searched for the Marine Sulphur Queen the next year, a T-2 tanker, a T-2 tanker bound from Beaumont, Texas to Norfolk, Virginia, due to the fact that radio messages indicated the 502-foot tanker had vanished between February 2nd and February 4th, 1963. The time between a message sent but return message not acknowledged. The ship also failed to make its routine reports thereafter. Initially, a huge search had turned up no clue or bodies of its 39 crew. Then, tardily, 20 miles southwest of Key West, Florida, several pieces of debris were sighted, retrieved, and easily identified as belonging to the MSQ. Because part of her signboard, the part remaining only containing the letters Arene Sulf. So the M was cut off, as well as the end of the word sulfur, was floating within the debris, the tattered nature of it indicating some unusual destruction that, taken together with the lack of an SOS, must have been spontaneous and without warning. Breaking in twain was suspected, since T2 tankers had shown that tendency, but the MSQ had been modified to carry liquid sulfur, which entailed installing a 300-foot tank down the center of the ship. And this is a 500-foot ship. Something that was thought, along with the necessary alternations in the bulkheads to accommodate it, would prevent the ship from splitting asunder as regular T2 tankers had done. So they were thinking that that fuel tank, the 300-foot fuel tank inside of a 500-foot vessel, right smack dab in the middle, would act as a stint to keep it from splitting in half if it got into any bad weather or seas. Does that make sense? A mere breaking in half could not explain, however, why the signboard should have been so tattered. Explosion of her liquid cargo was ruled out. Fires in the ship, completely independent of the cargo, were a possibility. The ship had suffered a fire before. Nevertheless, it was still hard to explain why there was no SOS. From the looks of two of the life rings retrieved, it seemed that they had been attacked by sharks, indicating 2 men had survived. These were speculated to have been worn by the men on watch, who alone of the crew had time to get into the sea when, presumably, the ship ignited and quickly plunged. While these cases above were major disappearances, most of which attracted news coverage to some extent, within this time frame, small aircraft and many yachts were vanishing, or, in the case of some yachts, being found strangely deserted with no sign of their crew. Just give me a moment here. The schooner Home Sweet Home had not long left Bermuda, January 13th, 1955, traveling south into the Triangle when Bermuda Radio received a call from the vessel. The time was 9:30 a.m. The captain, presumably, was merely initiating contact in a calm, steady voice, as one would while studying an observation, only saying, quote, "Bermuda, this is the HSH," end quote. Before Bermuda could reply, the yacht must have vanished. Hails went unanswered. What motivated the captain to hail Bermuda was not betrayed by his calm voice, but the possibility he was observing something peculiar becomes intriguing considering the vessel vanished before he could elaborate. Exactly what happened to the Snow Boy is still a subject of wonder. Searchers found no trace of the 63-foot converted PT-boat or any of the 40 persons aboard, each bound for an overnight fishing trip on July 4th, 1963, to nearby Pedro Banks, south of Kingston, Jamaica. Searchers, however, eventually found numerous fishing poles and even the dinghy, though empty yet floating upright. When the fishing charter had left the Kingston, she appeared quite overloaded to those at the marina. Nevertheless, the vessel had the latest radio equipment and a lifeboat, in which none of its passengers and crew were apparently able to get in, or remain in for long if they had. Circumstances appeared so unbelievable in the disappearance of a C-119, quote, flying boxcar, end quote, a military cargo flight on a routine cargo run to Grand Turk Island on June 5th, 1965, that when it was discovered that astronaut James McDivitt, while in orbit in Gemini 4, had seen a UFO beneath them over the Caribbean the day before. Attempts were made by the International UFO Bureau to link the two occurrences, despite thousands of miles separating the, quote, UFO, end quote, at orbital heights and the C-119 at its altitude of 9,000 feet over the Bahamas. Theorists pointing out that this is a mere matter of seconds difference for a UFO in terms of travel time. Radar had long captured the presence of UFOs, zooming through the scopes at thousands of miles per hour and making right-angled turns, among other seemingly impossible maneuvers that purely testified the object was not man-made in origin. When McDivitt reported the sun glinting off a silver object below, his report was stretched to become a clue to a disappearance which otherwise had no clue. The C-119 had taken off from Homestead Air Force Base, which is very close to Coral Castle, with a crew of 10. Its course was simple. It need only follow the, quote, Yankee route, end quote, a well-guarded air highway between southern Florida, over the Bahamas, and straight to Grand Turk. At 11 p.m., only 45 minutes from ETA, Major Giuntoli, and his last name spelled Giuntoli, the pilot, sent the routine report. Quote, there was no indication of trouble, and nothing had been heard from them since, end quote, reported the Coast Guard spokesman in Miami. A Homestead Air Force Base crewman added some intriguing inference when he carefully observed, quote, it's strange that the planes that go down in the Bahamas never leave a trace. The search was reputed to have found a dramatic clue, a wheel chalk from the aircraft bearing its number stenciled therein. Although the accident report does not allude to this discovery at all. Consideration of the radio and radar controls of, quote, Yankee route, end quote, would seem apt here. And in parentheses says, see map on following page. So let's look at that now. So this says, although far more dangerous and outback for the boater, for an aircraft, the Bahamas are transited in only hours and have many radio controls. The shallow Bahama banks are marked in outline. So let's take a quick look at this. See, we have Florida here. Got Cuba down here. And let me take another look real quick. I'm just checking all these names here that's listed on the map. Right here, that's outlined, this whole thing here, going from over here to over here, that's the Bahama Bank, the Grand Bahama Bank. So I assume all of that area is shallow. But this is what would be referred to as the Yankee Route, or Yankee Route, whatever you want to call it. So consideration of the radio and radar controls of the Yankee Route would seem apt here, as it sheds light on the surveillance of a route that many aircraft have traveled and disappeared on both before and after the C-119. It appears at first glance to be a very outback course, but it is one that is amply covered in radio communication controls, considerably more today than in 1965, though this has not aided in explaining the disappearances, but only served to heighten the mystery of what has happened to so many planes along here. Along the same route on April 5th, 1966, another military airplane vanished. However, in this case, the classic B-25 had been converted to a civilian cargo plane, the treasured prize of pilot Gian Nattress. And last name is spelled Nattress. In addition to hauling a cargo of frozen chicken parts, eggs, and spare aircraft parts, he was taking Bush Pilot Company owner George Golas, spelled Golas, and 17-year-old Ken Pecken to Aruba, Dutch West Indies. The flight was last known to be somewhere over the tongue of the ocean, a deep and unnatural-looking underwater gorge in the shallow Great Bahama Bank. In the shallow Great Bahama Bank itself, the most visible geologic oddity of the Bahamas. The disappearance of this aircraft was particularly mysterious, considering this air corridor parallels the Bahamas' largest island of Andros on one side and the long chain of the Exumas on the other. Popular halfway points for yachters who readily notice the drone of aircraft overhead, as the Yankee route is the main route on the Caribbean. The Yankee route is the main route to the Caribbean. Yet none noticed the heavy drone of the Nattress's B-25 suddenly fall silent. In addition to the traffic in the area, the Restricted Secret Weapons Testing and Development Base, AUTEC, is located on the east coast of Andros Island, a strategic location in order to take advantage of the depths of the ominous tongue of the ocean for testing of underwater missiles and revolutionary military undersea submersibles. As one might imagine for a highly sensitive base, it closely monitors airspace and radio frequencies, yet it too was another base that had no contact with the B-25. Considerable amount of mystery surrounds the discovering of a barge, floating intact and undisturbed, but which had been in tow behind the tug Southern Cities when it had left Freeport, Texas on October 29, 1966 for Tuxpan, Mexico. While the barge and its cable, including the attaching end to the tug, remained intact and undamaged, there was no sign of the Southern Cities. The unusual nature of this disappearance is what had caused the case to be commented on and often linked with the other disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle, despite the fact that it had vanished near Mexico. The similarities being the obvious indications that the crew and their vessel, rather than their cargo, appeared to be the interest to the cause of force. So it appeared to be of interest to the cause of force. Officially, quote, mishap, end quote, that mysteriously swept them away during their routine voyage. Hey, Missing Time. Good to see you. Missing Time says, aloha, Steve. I have to do the replay, but it'll be good for bedtime story. Excellent. Good to have you here. Taking into account, this case prompted author John Wallace Spencer, the first to write a book solely devoted to the Triangle incidents. And here's a good one. But this wasn't listed as the best. I wonder why. Limbo of the Lost from 1969. And that's by Wallace Spencer. So Wallace Spencer, the first to write a book solely devoted to the Triangle incidents. We're going to have to look that up and see what we can pull from that. Limbo of the Lost, 1969, to extend the reaches of the Bermuda Triangle into the Gulf of Mexico and speculate on alien abduction. A cause that obviously did not require the disappearances to be limited to the, quote, strict, end quote, triangle. He proposed that the actual area of danger to ships and planes extended around Bermuda, through the Caribbean islands, and taking in, apparently, the entire Gulf of Mexico. Hence, his reticence to refer to it as anything but a limbo. It is implicit in Spencer's theory that the, quote, danger zone, end quote, centered on the traditional triangle between Bermuda, Miami, and Puerto Rico, but especially in the Bahamas, where disappearances were mostly concentrated. His theory would later be added to by naturalist Ivan Sanderson, which he's come up plenty times here, who proposed that the Bahamas' unique underwater terrain made it an ideal base for UFOs and their underwater counterparts, USOs. According to either view, whatever would be considered, quote, raiding, end quote, territory within easy reach from this location would make it technically the, quote, danger zone, end quote. However, outre the theory sounds, later happenings in these precise areas, including a disappearance following the report of a UFO, with the mayday of the panicking pilot describing the, quote, weird object, end quote, recorded by a base station. I believe that's what we have playing at the beginning of the intros here. Not too sure on that yet. I'll have to look at that again. So the panicking pilot describing the, quote, weird object, end quote, recorded by a base station requires that elements of the disquieting theory be taken into serious consideration later. Others have speculated on the exact, or for some more variable shape and location of the triangle. Unlike John Spencer's, quote, limbo, end quote, however, these other shapes and sizes are based on the location of the greatest concentration of missing vessels and the aircraft rather than using such an area for a base and then accepting every other disappearance relatively nearby, except each takes into consideration rare incidents in outlying waters, such as the C-133s or the southern cities. By the time of the southern cities' disappearance, the name, quote, Bermuda Triangle, end quote, had been coined. It had first been put forward in the February 1964 edition of Argosy magazine and an article written by Vincent Gaddis. The title, quote, The Deadly Bermuda Triangle, end quote, had merely clarified the earlier and somewhat colloquial expression, quote, deadly triangle, end quote, for the area. But this was not the first time a triangular shape had been suggested. It was first proposed in an October 1952 Fate magazine article in which the author George X. Sand dubbed the area a, quote, watery triangle, end quote, a name that with some time would hold a double meaning considering the shape of the triangle is rather fluid. Puerto Rico, Bermuda, and Miami had emerged quickly in 1948 as the nodal points between which the rash of airliners had vanished, and within this same triangle, Flight 19 had been flying in 1945. Continuing disappearances always highlighted the nodal points, with the southwest corner off Florida noteworthy for the heaviest concentration of unexplained disappearances. Freighters that had vanished were also sailing toward it or through it when last heard from, or from computations of their speed or from lack of subsequent and expected routine position reports, were estimated to have entered the area but not to have emerged. Sailing south to Miami, for example, the 150-foot schooner Enchantress was approaching the, quote, strict triangle, end quote, off South Carolina when something struck so quickly there was only time for a short SOS in which the captain, Count Christopher D. Gebrowski, Gebrowski, said they were heeling over, Heeling, heeling over. Evangeline was sailing to the Bahamas from nearby Miami in 1962 and vanished. Between the Bahamas and North Carolina, the Callista III was last reported and then was never seen again after leaving on April 25, 1961. Cruising along the Keys, heading to Miami, the disappearance of the schooner Ravonic on New Year's Eve 1958 was so unbelievable because of both the all-weather design of the champion racer, and the ability of its master, Harvey Conover, and his last name spelled Conover. That fellow yachtsman speculated that a freighter had run down the schooner without knowing it. On the short routes between Miami and the Bahamas, the sailboat Bounty vanished around July 1956. George Boston left Miami in his houseboat El Gato, voyaging to the next corner of the triangle, San Juan, Puerto Rico, put in at Georgetown, Exuma, Bahamas, and then left there for Great Inagua on October 28, 1965, and then vanished sometime after. Before the moniker Bermuda Triangle was born, the concept of an area of danger, quote unquote, showed how each disappearance subsequent to Flight 19 continued to inspire curiosity, not just because of the circumstances, but because of the location. By the time Gaddis's article presented, quote, presented, quote, Bermuda Triangle, end quote, for the reader, the name just seemed to stick. So by the time he said Bermuda Triangle and used it in his article, it already just seemed to make sense. Quote, Deadly Triangle, end quote, was good enough locally, but, quote, Bermuda Triangle, end quote, brought with it instant geographic recognition for a world increasingly interested in the area's unusual enigma. Coupled with the new catchy and handy moniker, the phenomenon easily crystallized in the public mind. Continuing disappearances were easy to fit into the Bermuda Triangle concept, at least geographically, and with the enigma of those that had vanished in these seas before. Each new case was now given considerably more press coverage and popular speculation and comment. Within a week's time, in January 1967, 3 smaller aircraft vanished, something that was becoming more commonplace, especially in the Miami, Bahamas corner of the triangle, because small aircraft were the travel of choice to access the nearby Florida Keys and Bahamian vacation ports, though 3 in 1 week was cause for alarm. Heading toward nearby Bimini, or Bimini, I think the pronunciation's Bimini. Heading toward nearby Bimini from Miami, a Chase YC-122 in cargo for an Ivan Tours movie shoot vanished on January 11th, 1967. If they were going to use this ship for a movie and it went through that location and just disappeared, should have known better. Heading toward nearby Bimini from Miami, a Chase YC-122 in cargo for an Ivan Tours movie shoot vanished on January 11th, 1967, although minimal debris was later found. In the next case, one is reminded of the DC-3 in 1948 and the mystery of the lack of debris. With 4 people aboard, a twin beach craft had taken off from Miami on January 14, 1967, and headed south to Key Largo and then along the Keys, a route entirely over shallow water and broken keys along the Intercoastal Highway. Yet, like Lindquist's DC-3, it utterly vanished. reminding us of the shape of the triangle yet again. A Piper Apache with 3 aboard had left from San Juan, Puerto Rico on January 17th, 1967 for an hour flight to St. Thomas in the nearby Virgin Islands, only to disappear. Even if the litany of missing ships and planes should include a few incidents far removed from the traditional triangle, yet in the adjacent waters, it should be obvious to the nodal points of the Bermuda Triangle were aptly chosen. The extent to which small aircraft were mysteriously disappearing was not appreciable until decades later, when this present observer had a computer database search done. I'm sorry, I gotta reread that. The extent to which small aircraft were mysteriously disappearing was not appreciable until decades later, when this present observer had a computer database search done of the records of the National Transportation Safety Board. Starting with the year 1962, the results uncovered the alarming average of 4 airplanes per year, each missing in fair weather. Each diligently searched for, and many equipped with ELTs, which is the acronym for Emergency Locator Transmitter. An electronic SOS which is launched from the fuselage upon impact and is traceable by other aircraft and base stations. In parentheses, and later even by satellites, end parentheses, so that the precise area of the accident can be pinpointed quickly and rescuers directed with accuracy. Each, nevertheless, vanished without any indication they ever crashed into the ocean, the event that would commence the signal. Speculation on what forces are at work, for lack of a better word, in the Bermuda Triangle added to the exciting discussions of the subject during the heyday of the triangle fever in the 1970s. In addition to John Spencer's theory of alien abduction, each new book and radio or TV program added more intriguing suggestions, each based on plenty of newer disappearances to discuss, including surprising discoveries made through pertinacious research from those deeply committed to uncovering what was happening to so many people, ships, and planes. For instance, it was in 1973 that the International UFO Bureau made so much about a possible link between the disappearance of the C-119 flying boxcar on June 5th, 1965, and a UFO reported by astronaut James McDivitt the day before while in orbit over the Caribbean in Gemini 4. The latest disappearances added to the increasing momentum of interest in the subject, such as the disappearance of Navion N5126K on May 25th, 1973. Pilot Bob Corner had taken friend Reno Rigon, that's spelled Rigon, along for a flight to Freeport, Grand Bahama, a short run from Miami. Midway over the Gulf Stream, he was contacted by Palm Beach Radio Control and warned that heavy weather lay between him and his destination. Along with another aircraft on the same route, about 10 minutes behind him, Corner was rerouted to the south around the heavy weather. He duly acknowledged, and this was the last heard from him. Alerts that Corner's plane had not come in for a landing were radioed quickly. Close to landing, the plane traveling behind him turned around and crisscrossed over the route in an effort to find him. This pilot, though having flown just behind the Navion, had experienced no trouble of any kind. Considering its speed of near 200 miles per hour, it was only minutes behind Corner, yet no Mayday message had been received or intercepted. There was no indication on the surface that there had been a crash. Rescue operations were soon augmented by Coast Guard cutters and aircraft, though once again the search proved fruitless. Because there was a plane traveling the same route behind Corner, it was easy for investigators to get a first-hand description of the weather. The rerouting had taken the flights completely out of harm's way, and there was simply no accounting for why or how the Navion had vanished. So I have another map here. The location of major disappearances until 1980. Missing planes numbered in triangles, whereas missing vessels are marked in squares. Consult the index beginning on page 101. So I guess there's an index of all these missing ships and how they correlate. And planes as well. So the planes are the triangles, and the ships are the squares on this. You can see right off the coast of New England there, and actually pretty far out. But that's the tip of the triangle. And then we get over here. And there's a whole bunch more down here. Despite the popularity of Bermuda Triangle and the concept at this time, most disappearances simply did not become public knowledge. Except for major disappearances, few were contained in the books and magazine articles, which were themselves largely based only on newspaper accounts rather than official investigative reports and statistics maintained by such bureaus as the National Transportation Safety Board. So you got to think about this too. There were so many disappearances that the government would just not report to the public. But yet the ones that slipped through gave everybody this air of mystery enough where like they wanted to know more. And it seems like they were only given, I want to say like 10% of the overall disappearances. Like the public only got 10% of it, right? So imagine if every single disappearance was reported to the public. We'd be in a much different conversation right now. Because a lot more people would have researched all of this. This was hidden behind FOIA requests. Gian J Quasar had to go out and FOIA request all this stuff probably from the Navy. And all these other different acting organizations that are researching these disappearances. And not releasing it for public consumption. It's just all internal. I don't know how it disappeared. Scant information and often errored reportorial accounts allowed for some initially successful attempts to debunk the very idea the number of missing aircraft and ships was unusual, let alone that the circumstances of the disappearances cause for concern. The most notable attempt culminated in a book in 1975 whose title, The Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved, garnered the book more publicity than its contents deserved. Yeah, and that's why we're not reading that book. Taking only a selective number of cases, 57 in all, the author claimed to have solved the phenomenon, usually by using newspaper articles that indicated there had been some rough weather or a delayed search. So that author of this book we're never going to read, he was just basing his assumptions off of what the public knowledge was. They didn't dig further into this like Gian was, like getting the FOIA requests. For those articles that did not conveniently mention foul weather, he speculated on some prosaic cause, though he admitted that the quote big end quote cases, i.e. the most famous and inexplicable, remained baffling. Oh, no shit. Research since that time, however, has revealed that between 1962 and 1980, as many as 57 aircraft had vanished, of which no author, proponent of the triangle, or otherwise, had been aware. In essence, for every case the author claimed to have solved, more than 10 could be added to the litany of those missing. So we're talking like less than 10% were given to the public. Considerably more now if we take the statistics and cases of the last 40 years into the equation, which in parentheses says to be discussed in chapter 4. End parentheses. Moreover, in 1977, Miami Herald journalist Carl Hiasson, not sure how to pronounce this, last name's spelled Hiasson, obtained a U.S. Coast Guard database search of missing vessels between 1971 and 1977. He was inspired by the continuing and disturbing number of reports coming back from the local marinas and harbors, which he, of course, as a local newsman, had been continually hearing about. Yachts simply never came back or never arrived at their intended port of call. Over the period of 1971 to 1977, the Coast Guard listed 44 vessels missing. While piracy was suspected in a number of them, for 17 of these vessels, the Coast Guard would not even speculate as to the cause. Clandestine drug smuggling required getting fast-power yachts in order to make the runs between the islands, often Cuba, into the sequestered Gulf Coast of Florida feasible. Unsuspecting yacht owners were usually the target. It had been a long and accepted tradition in the area that when students came south and needed or wanted to get to the nearby Bahamas, a yachtsman already intending to go would take them free or even use them for crew on a more extended trip, in parentheses, such as a few days to Nassau to attend the local festival, the Junkanoo, spelled Junkanoo, end parentheses. By the mid-1970s, however, this was the exact means by which pirates were getting passage. Once at sea, they would take over the ship at gunpoint, weapons would be concealed in their duffel, kill the occupants, cast the bodies over, and use the yacht for a limited time as a drug runner before sinking it and repeating their pattern with their next intended victims. One notable example of possible piracy is that of the 54-foot luxury yacht Saba Bank. That's two words spelled Sababank, which vanished in April 1974 with 4 men from New Jersey aboard. No trace was ever found of the yacht after it had departed Nassau. Rumors indicated they may have taken help aboard, being that none of them were familiar with the unique currents and sandbars of the Bahamas, or because each preferred to spend their long-planned vacation partying on a sun-drenched teak deck without diversion to the cumbersome details of navigation. Extending over only a period of 7 years, the Coast Guard readout constitutes the mere tip of the iceberg, so to speak, for the 1970s, and even more so for the decades before and afterwards, remaining completely unrecorded over the period of 1978 and 1979, a mere 2 years. Over 20 aircraft would vanish, compared to the usual 4, which was already unusual. A few in circumstances that tempt rational explanations, and this represents only a fraction of what has now transpired in the last 39 years since this phenomenal 2-year crisis. Of those vessels on Hyesan's list, whose disappearance the Coast Guard could or would ascribe to piracy, even theoretically, they may have only used a tenuous and presumptive criterion. For example, reasons such as the power and endurance of the yacht. Reasons for hesitation to include a vessel may have been that it was too slow, such as a sailboat or motor sailor, large, languishing yachts not capable of the fast cruising speed of power and luxury yachts. Considering that powerful yachts have vanished in sensational circumstances in which piracy would not have played a factor, there is room to doubt whether the disappearance of large and faster yachts were all due to piracy, at least merely because of this factor. The unusual, to say the least, circumstances involved in the disappearance of the 24-foot cabin cruiser Witchcraft are an example of those that defy logic. The cabin cruiser was most definitely alone until it hit an unidentified and unexplained object underneath it at the entrance to Miami's safe harbor, about only 1 mile from shore, on the night of December 22nd, 1967. Owner Dan Burack, that's last name spelled B-U-R-A-C-K, had taken his friend Father Padraig Horgan out to see the Christmas lights of Miami. The vantage from buoy 7 by government cut was ideal. And that's in capital letters, government cut. It is from this point, close to 9 p.m., that Burack contacted the Coast Guard and said he had hit something below. Fearing he might have bent his propeller, he asked for a tow. In only 19 minutes, the Coast Guard rescue boat was slicing its beam of searchlight through the darkness, and though the beam crisscrossed buoy 7 several times, there was no trace of Burack's Witchcraft. The search soon expanded and took in 1,200 square miles of sea, mostly to the north of Miami. Assuming that the cabin cruiser could have gotten sucked out into the fast northbound current of the Gulf Stream after a squall had hit later that night. A complete disappearance of the Witchcraft was some cause for discussion. Burack was an outspoken proponent of boating safety. He had outfitted his cabin cruiser with the latest flotation devices, including life rings, floatable cushions, and rafts. Secondly, Witchcraft itself had built-in flotation and was for all intents and purposes unsinkable. Buoyancy may not have remained, but some part of the boat would have remain languishing above the surface. Without any trace having been found, we are left to speculate on the last words he reportedly had spoken through his microphone. Looking down into the dark ocean, he observed lights or mentioned that something was down there. Another unlikely candidate for piracy is the 338-foot coastal freighter El Caribe, and that's spelled Caribe, which had vanished with all 28 crew sometime between October 10th and October 14th, 1971. While in passage between Barranquilla to Santo Domingo, with nothing more valuable than a cargo of cement clinkers. In this case, there was a conspicuous postscript of mystery. She had been outfitted with the new electronic EPIRB. It never signaled, indicating the ship had not sunk. For this reason alone, piracy was at first feared, but with continuing investigation, it seemed unlikely. In 1971, an aircraft disappeared in circumstances that once again highlight the unusual. This was a supersonic Phantom II F-4E Air Force jet. At the time of its disappearance, it was south of Florida. And south from its base at Homestead Air Force Base in routine maneuvers. Its pilot, Norm Northrup, was practicing under the guidance of Top Gun pilot Harry Romero. Homestead Vector Control, nicknamed Blissful Control, noted that the Selective Identification Feature, or SIF, of this aircraft was fading, something that reminds us of one of the missing C-133s. They contacted the flight in order to make sure it was the one they were tracking at the border of Alpha 6 sector. Northrop responded, quote, "Roger, I am in a port turn at this time," end quote. And then the aircraft vanished. Other Phantom IIs in the area were redirected to the spot. Only one saw an area of, quote, "water discoloration," end quote. That was 200 feet long and 100 feet wide and oblong in shape. With one end above the water and the other end underneath. The Coast Guard cutter Steadfast was 5 miles distant, and by the time it arrived, there was no oblong shape to see. The exact nature of this oblong discoloration must have been clarified by the pilot, or at least speculated upon, but the next paragraph in the released report was redacted, meaning there was nothing but a huge square cut into the page where the paragraph otherwise would have been. A clear example of censorship. In order to set the record straight, it is necessary to go back and touch on a few cases. For instance, the mystery in the disappearance of the Home Sweet Home in January 1955 was also later minimized by noting that a hurricane had struck on its course through the triangle. However, in a fair gesture, Captain John Waters, once head of Coast Guard Search and Rescue, wrote how he visited the vessel and crew the night before they left. He warned them of approaching foul weather, and several expressed concern and even that they wanted to go back to the U.S. East Coast instead. When the HSH contacted Bermuda the next morning, therefore, we may wonder if the captain's voice was calm because he was merely informing Bermuda of their new course back to the U.S. and away from the storm, though why they then vanished still remains intriguing. Considerable mystery should still surround the Connemara 4, a 70-foot yacht found derelict 150 miles southeast of Bermuda on September 26, 1955, by the freighter Olympic Cloud. Attempts to minimize the unusual circumstances of the discovery of the deserted yacht remind us that the 4 successive hurricanes had struck the fringes of that area. Thus, taking the argument to its logical conclusion, the crew must have one by one or altogether thrown themselves over, each being incapable of enduring the incessant rough weather. However, it is equally apparent by the helmless vessel's survivor of the hurricanes that the yacht could have been abandoned. It could have been abandoned before the storms even hit, and then breasted them on its own. Got a few pages left. Ivan Sanderson pertinently observed that any deserted boat should be taken as quite an intriguing mystery, noting that, quote, even an inexperienced or leaderless crew seldom, if ever, abandons ship because of storm. To do so is obviously asinine, because if the ship won't hold up, no yawl, gig, or small lifeboat can do so. End quote. Waves of derelict vessels are obviously a particularly alarming occurrence. Taking one grouping in 1969 off the Azores as reflecting a cross-section, a number of causes can be put forward. A capsized 36-foot sailboat was found drifting between Bermuda and the Azores on July 13th, its position explained by the strong North Atlantic drift, which would carry any vessel deserted in the Triangle or north of Bermuda to a point off the southeast coast of the island group. Probably more than one explanation can account for at least 3 other sightings. One on July 12th, when what appeared to be a deserted 35-foot yacht on automatic steering was sighted heading eastward in, quote, mid-Atlantic, end quote. On course for Australia from Stockholm, Peter Wallen had vanished, and his deserted sailboat Vagabond was found ship-shape off the Azores. Of most interest is the case of the Teignmouth Electron. That's spelled Teignmouth Electron, 2 words. Found about 200 miles distant from the Vagabond, in parentheses, 700 miles southwest of the Azores, and end parentheses, on July 10th. The Trimaran had been captained by Donald Crowhurst, spelled Crowhurst, a contestant in the Golden Globe Round the World race, who seems to have gone barking mad, judging by entries in his log where he is speaking to God. At last, no longer in possession of himself, he stepped over into the sea. So something else was, just like with the with those voices possibly coming from mercury in the ocean, reflecting radio signals off. Or other entities entirely that are living in the ocean. Never know. Something made him step off. I'd like to know the content of those entries. Another grouping occurred over August, September, and October 1972 off Puerto Rico, concurrent with the, quote, Adjuntas flap, end quote, the name given to a rash of UFO sightings that radiated out from the mountainous village of Adjuntas to the west coast of Puerto Rico around Cabo Rojo and Aguadilla, precisely where the deserted vessels were later found. So again, people missing, boats just fine. All right. Although the flap was unusual, the sighting of UFOs is not a rarity in this area off Puerto Rico, as we will later find out in this volume. In comment on how frequently UFOs are seen in the area, particularly in Laguna, Cartagena, Federico Cruz, director of civil aviation in La Haye, has confessed, albeit to his chagrin, quote, "We have seen brightly colored ovoid and round objects as they overfly the area, making right-angled turns, and sometimes they enter the lagoon and disappear underwater." End quote. Those listed as missing according to the Coast Guard list, in parentheses prepared for Carl Hyson, end parentheses, include a 20-foot sailboat, Saint-Ois Flian. That's two words spelled Saintois Flean. Montserrat to Martinique with 4 persons aboard. So I guess that's the travel location from Montserrat to Martinique with 4 persons aboard, February 1971. Playmate, a 24-foot cabin cruiser, Martinique to Guadeloupe, March 1971, with 3 crew. The 65-foot motor sailor Princess, Gulf of Mexico, with 3 crew on board, also in March 1971. Reborn, a 22-foot cabin cruiser off Barbados, April 1971, with 2 men aboard on a local trip. A particularly curious disappearance is that of Joven Serena, a 74-foot yacht on a short trip from Miami to Orange Cay, Bahamas, with only the skipper aboard in June of 1971. A 33-foot schooner from Montauk with the humorous name of Red Jack, in parentheses Jack the Ripper's nickname, end quote, or end parentheses, vanished in the Bermuda Triangle en route to Bermuda and then to the Virgin Islands in December 1971. Only the skipper was aboard. Weather is not always listed in such long printouts, and as time has passed, the facility, and even, to be honest, the effort cannot be mounted to find every detail in these old cases. It thus does not serve any useful purpose to recount an old list of vessels, and the vagueness of their circumstances. However, a few more merit some attention due to their short routes or type of boat, which made it unlikely that they were the subject of piracy. Such is the case of Miss Scotty II, a 29-foot cabin cruiser which left Miami for Freeport, Grand Bahama in October 1972 with 2 crew. The Teskema was a 75-foot trawler which vanished before arriving at Grand Cayman Island, also in October, with her crew aboard. The 45-foot ketch Silver Dawn disappeared between New Hampshire and Bermuda, with 3 crew aboard in January 1973. And that's a long trip from New Hampshire to Bermuda. I wonder how many days that is on boat. More details exist for the 73-foot shrimper Dawn, which vanished off Key West sometime after April 22nd, 1975, when a passing boat saw her anchored 10 miles northwest of Smith Shoals Light. A large search found no trace or any of the bodies of the 3 men known to have been aboard. Then there is the case of 53-foot yacht Ixtapa, and that's spelled I-X-T-A-P-A. Ixtapa? Don't know how to pronounce that. Which must have been annihilated somewhere near here around Christmas time 1971 on her voyage from Cozumel to Marathon in the Keys. On December 28th, part of her cabin was found awash in the Gulf Stream and finally towed to port. Since there was no indication of explosion, one excited theorist offered that, quote, spacemen, end quote, had to remove the cabin in order to, quote, get at the hiding crew, end quote. Searches by the Coast Guard were prompt for most of these cases, but those that vanished without filing any boat plan simply eventually end up as statistics. Comprehensive searches included radio sweeps, following the track line, taking into account the drift, involved grid searches by multiple aircraft and cutters, and alerts to all civilian traffic to be on the lookout. Comment was frequent and lively on radio and television around the Florida coast each time a new disappearance was reported. Naturally, the most vocal were those ready to offer a new theory or observe, as in the case of the Ixtapa and other disappearances, that only alien intelligences can account for the missing crews. An opinion essentially based on the fact that the cases were becoming more inexplicable despite our own technological advances, which still could not prevent disappearances or explain how such little trace had been found from so many ships. But one far less esoteric observation has proven pertinent over time. It was noted that most of the disappearances, at least those that beggar the imagination, occurred during the holiday months, that is, November through January, giving rise to the term, quote, Christmas time hex, end quote. Radio personality Robbie Young, spelled Y-O-N-G-E, proposed that a boat be rented and manned with dummies. Aboard would be cameras and monitoring equipment. Yeah, I don't think you can fool these interdimensional entities doing that. They'll know if there's life forms on the boat or if they're dummies. Thus, if or when anything untoward happened there would be a visually recorded account of it. This is presuming, of course, that before the vessel or the dummies vanished, the live feed would not be discontinued by any electromagnetic disruption, a phenomenon frequently associated with the disappearance of UFOs, and one noted by those who have survived unusual encounters with, quote, electronic fog, end quote, in the triangle. An unusual interruption, both in terms of phone callers and electronic phone line switches, occurred live on the air to WFTL, late night radio host. So I think that's Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale. WFTL late night radio show host Ray Smithers on April 13th, 1975, when he was conducting a hotline show on the Triangle. This event, preserved as the, quote, creepy caller, end quote, episode, still remains unexplained to this day. After finding each line on his in-studio phone dead, though each line's light was blinking indicating a caller was waiting in queue, Smithers finally got a live connection. On the other end, a voice spoke. Smithers, WFTL, hello, you're on the air. The caller. There's one of you on the program who will understand what I'm going to say. Every living thing on this planet has an aura. It is its communication with the millionth council who governs this planet. The area that you are discussing now is the aura of this planet. It is the communicative channel through which the millionth council governs this planet. Smithers asks, which council, sir? Or which council, sir? And the caller says, the millionth council. And we're going to look into that. So Ray Smithers on WFTL. Oh, man. We're almost done here, guys. We got less than a page and a half to go. Smithers asks, the millionth? And the caller says, millionth. Anyone going into the area when the communicative channels is open, do not disappear. But they are in a timeless void. They're all perfectly alive and well. It is the only area through which the council can communicate with this planet. And the call cuts off. Recorded and preserved, the voice print was analyzed and studied, indicating that the caller was not hoaxing. Stress at certain words indicated he fully believed what he was saying. Almost as a dramatic postscript to the strange call, on April 22nd, 1975, just over a week later, there would be no trace of the shrimper Dawn off Key West. Only a week later, on April 30th, an outboard Magnum was found deserted and motor still running off West End, Grand Bahama. Continuing disappearances that year would include a number of sailing vessels en route to Bermuda, with 2 happening in June, an ocean-going tug with the exuberant name of Boundless in December, and a coaster off the Leeward Islands, to name only a few. Each was an exclamation point in its way for about any theory proposed about the triangle. As we will see in future chapters, dozens of aircraft would join their ranks in the 1970s. For all intents and purposes, the 1970s would see the triangle both flower in terms of popularity and eventually wither under the assaults of debunkers who insisted, based on the paltry number of cases in the public forum or recorded and discussed in books and magazines, that the subject was merely the result of inaccurate and sensationalistic reporting, until this present observer would rejuvenate the subject 20 years later with over 100 additional disappearances. The subject essentially went into Deep Six itself, the metaphoric end for all those listed as missing in, quote, Davy Jones's locker, end quote. Worldwide interest in the Bermuda Triangle had brought forth a valuable clue, however. Historical research uncovered many disappearances and, even more intriguing, the repeating theme of deserted vessels found in the area. Nothing underscores the reality of the Bermuda Triangle enigma as does an abandoned ship, a unique type of mystery in the history of travel. Until the advent of wireless in the 19th century, only one thing was capable of pinpointing any location of mystery: the discovery of something as inexplicable as the ship itself, deserted but ship-shape. With currents and drift computed, each ghostly hulk testified that it had sailed through the area today delineated for the Bermuda Triangle. Before we continue to the present time, we must take a look at what history has uncovered for us over a considerably longer span of time than a few decades. And with that is the end of chapter 2. Yeah, we actually made it under 2 hours. I'm glad. So next week's episode, we'll cover chapter 3, Over a Past Horizon. I believe this is a single installment episode. Yeah. So, the Bermuda Triangle is the aura of the planet, and is the only place where the millionth council can communicate with us, whatever that means. So that's it today, guys. If you missed Tuesday's show, we have a new Coral Castle installment that's up. And we'll see what we do for Sunday. But be assured that we'll be back on Tuesday. And if I am doing a Sunday show, it'll pop up in the live feed for upcoming shows. So just keep an eye on that if you're looking out for it. But that's a lot to take in. But I think that's the nugget of today's show. The Bermuda Triangle is the aura of the planet. And that the guy said all disappearances of people, they're all good and well. They're in a timeless void, but they're all well. And speaking of a timeless void, that's what next Tuesday's Coral Castle show is going to be covering. The Philadelphia experiment. Another disappearing vessel on the military level. So, that's it. That'll be it for today. I appreciate y'all being here. Please hit a like if you haven't already. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And that's all I could really ask for, guys. I'm out here on my own doing this. Until the next one, class dismissed.